All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating theory from one particular source that says the world's strategic map is being completely redrawn right now in front of our very eyes. The argument is that we're shifting away from all those old alliances and moving into a new era where it's all about national self-interest.
Now this is the whole ballgame right here. The source uses this incredibly powerful image to argue that something fundamental has just changed. So our job in this explainer is to figure out exactly what the source thinks is happening to that imperial chessboard.
So what's the big idea? What's the central thesis here? Well, it's this notion that a new world order is bubbling up, one where the great powers are finally starting to act in their own sovereign interests. And this is being presented as a direct challenge to what the source calls an empire, a system that it claims actually thrives by keeping those same powers locked in a state of permanent, maybe even manufactured, conflict.
To really get this argument, we've got to wrap our heads around this key term, sovereign realism. The way the source presents it, this is a worldview where nations, think the US, Russia, and China, are operating based on what's good for them, for their own distinct national interests. They're not just playing these pre-assigned roles as permanent enemies in some grand ideological drama. Let's see how the source actually builds this case.
Okay, so the first pillar of the whole argument focuses on the United States. The source is claiming that America is very deliberately separating its own foreign policy goals from those of its key allies, and it points to specific statements from President Trump about Ukraine and the Middle East as proof.
Now, what's so interesting here is how the source connects two conflicts that seem totally separate, right? On one side, you've got these quotes framing President Zelenskyy as the obstacle to making a deal with Russia. And on the other, you have statements making it super clear that American goals for Iran are, quote, a little different from Israel's. The source argues this isn't a mixed message at all. It's one single consistent policy of sovereign interest. It's America first.
Let's move on to the second piece of evidence. So while the source claims the U.S. was busy separating itself from its allies' agendas, it also argues that Russia took a massive step. It came right out and named the entity it sees as actively sabotaging peace. And according to this analysis, that name was Britain.
This timeline is absolutely crucial to the source's argument. It lays out a direct sequence of events. First, there's a strike using British missiles. That's followed almost immediately by a direct accusation from Russia's foreign ministry pointing the finger right at Britain. And then, just a little while later, a major British think tank publishes an article with a headline that, in the source's view, basically just admits it. Europe is helping Ukraine resist a U.S. push for peace.
And to really hammer this point home about fracturing alliances, the source highlights this whole episode with Ukraine's President Zelenskyy. After he allegedly made threats against the Prime Minister of Hungary, which is an EU and NATO member, by the way, he was publicly called out by the EU itself. The source presents this as more evidence that Zelenskyy is becoming more and more isolated, even inside his own coalition. Now for the third piece of evidence. And honestly, this one might be the biggest shocker of them all. According to the source, this all went down at the United Nations Security Council, where a huge vote on Iran completely went off script, defying what the source calls the 80-year-old playbook.
You see, according to that old Cold War playbook, the rules were simple. In a vote to condemn their partner, Iran, everyone, and I mean everyone, expected Russia and China to use their veto power. That was the script. They were supposed to protect their ally, block the Western move, and keep everyone in their assigned corners. But that's not what happened.
Instead of a veto, they both abstained. They just sat it out. Now, according to this analysis, this was a stunning break from how things are usually done. By choosing not to shield Iran from this resolution, which was brought by its Arab neighbors, Russia and China basically stepped outside of the roles everyone expected them to play.
And the result? A resolution that passed 13-0. Think about that. This unanimous condemnation, which was only possible because of those two key abstentions, is framed by the source as a massive signal that a new strategic reality is forming. One where those old binary us versus them conflicts, they're just not guaranteed anymore. So, here's the crucial part. How do all these different pieces actually fit together? The source weaves the U.S. statements, Russia's accusation, and that wild UN vote into one single story that, it claims, builds a brand new strategic map of the world.
The source sees this quote as basically the smoking gun for sovereign realism. When President Trump says, they do it and we do it, the analysis argues he's putting America, Russia, and China all on the same level, as sovereign nations, each acting in their own interest. not as these locked-in ideological enemies, but just as countries dealing with each other on a practical, realistic basis.
So let's just put it all together. Step 1. The U.S. separates its own goals from its allies. Step 2. Russia actually puts a name to the opposition, calling out Britain. Step 3. Russia and China break the old geopolitical rules at the UN. The conclusion drawn by the source is that these great powers are starting to act on their own converging interests, instead of just playing the part they were assigned in someone else's game.
And that brings us to the final, really provocative question this whole analysis poses. It asks us to seriously consider if these events, when you put them all together, truly represent the tectonic plates of global power shifting right under our feet. Is this the end of the old chessboard and the beginning of a completely new game? Well, that's the theory this source asks us to think about.